Thank you all for being here. Before we begin, I just want to start with a quick disclaimer that everything Dr. James is about to say today represents the official opinion of the Department of Comparative Literature. And is the editor of the Angela Y. Davis Reader, Imprisoned Intellectuals, The New Abolitionists, and many other important works. So without further etc., please join me in welcoming our keynote speaker, Dr. Joy James. Thank you.
Thank you. Good morning. Thank you for the kind introduction. And it's good to know, I'm sure it's true of all of us in this room, that our collective work together can have an impact on the world and also the impact on critical thinking. So whatever I've been able to accomplish over decades has been a community of intellectuals, has been produced by a community of intellectuals. We don't all agree, definitely not anymore like we used to in the 90s. But I do think that going forward, it's our capacity to think collectively, to work collectively, and also, you know, your work as well that I briefly know of that you describe, to take risk in theory, but as we spoke about, or I was trying to speak about last night at the book talk, to think about what devotion might mean, right? I mean, there's the career trajectory, and I climbed it, and I got somewhere, you know, that, you know, feed family and give healthcare. But it's actually the life of the mind, and we borrow from Hannah Arendt. The life of the mind is so dynamic that it's a gift. And if we can share it with each other and for the right causes, I think then it's a promise. So I want to talk about three worlds, mostly stemming from the Cold War era, because I was old enough to roll around a bit in it. And then moving to the Civil Rights era, and then to the post-Panther era, the formation of the Republic of New Africa after the Panthers were decimated, not just by the FBI, but I would argue, and it'd be controversial for some people, that the West Coast Panthers engaged in organized crime in ways that were compatible with the state's desire to have an anti-revolutionary or counter-revolutionary formation. So again, the Panthers that I know and I've worked with over the decades are East Coast, they were Harlem-based, they understood themselves to be revolutionaries. That was different from what was going on the West Coast, at least in Oakland. What was happening in LA with Geronimo Pratt was different. He did 27 years, and then I'll start reading in a minute, framed by the FBI, but also with the collusion of Huey Newton, because he was at a meeting with the Panthers in Northern California when, unfortunately, a woman was murdered in Southern California. The FBI knew that because they were taping the meeting, and the Panthers knew that because they were at the meeting. But Huey said that Panthers who testified to his innocence would be expelled from the party, and Kathleen Cleaver had the courage to be honest and also to get a JD from Yale. And over years, with Johnny Cochran and Stuart Hamlin, were able to get Geronimo out. And I met Geronimo briefly, so he would not be like one of the Panthers that I've talked to over years or decades, like he's transitioned. But what I'm trying to gesture to is that in our own movements, the betrayals come, as Sophia Bukhari said, they come from within and they come from without. And so our capacity to recognize betrayal, I think, is tied not just by our emotional neediness to have heroes and celebrities, right? Or to feel that we can be safe in a democracy that grew out of genocide and enslavement. But our capacity is to actually confront our contradictions and move forward. A couple of weeks ago, I was at Bucknell giving a talk, and I met this wonderful philosopher of religion, and she is an empiricist. And over wine, which I guess is the best way to have discourse, Chardonnay is my preference, we started to talk about quantum entanglement. And so in the honor of Carol Wade White, I'm going to title this Quantum Entanglement. And at the end, I'm going to try to see if the capacity that I talked about or gestured to gesture towards as a collective endeavor is that entanglement, and so our possibilities are greater than on my worst days I think they might be. So part one, the Cold War context. Post-World War II era, anti-colonial struggles in that era destabilized the old order of European hegemony. There would emerge three discernible worlds. First world of Western European nations in the United States and Canada and their allies, the second world of the communist bloc of the Soviet Union, the third world of racially denigrated and exploited territories reduced or controlled or contained as colonies seeking independence and nationhood, the so-called non-whites in Africa, Asia, the Middle East, the Caribbean, and Latin America. They coexisted with their designation, at least in the US, as the internal colony. And I can't speak much to what was going on with Puerto Rican independentistas, and even though I've anthologized them, as well as American Indian movement, but I focus on the internal colony here as the Black formation. And the oppression through financial strangulation and manipulated markets that have been the rule for colonization that would shape now the neo-colonies. But rule over colonies created by Western Europeans fell apart after World War II, and that's what I want to start with. The origin of these three worlds that intermingle, the two worlds, or at least the second world that disappeared with 1991 with Gorbachev, and the world, the contemporary world that I'm just like to shrink it down, of anti-Black terror. The day after the Third Reich invaded the Soviet Union, violating a non-aggression pact the Soviets had signed in order to stave off such an invasion, Mao Zedong wrote in, the title of this is On the International United Front Against Fascism. It was a June 23, 1941 directive for the Central Committee of the Communist Party of China. And in that missive, or in that statement, he wrote, "The fascist rulers of Germany attacked the Soviet Union. This is a perfidious crime of aggression, not only against the Soviet Union, but against the freedom and independence of all nations. The Soviet Union's sacred war of resistance against fascist aggression is being waged not only in its own defense, but in defense of all the nations struggling to liberate themselves from fascist enslavement." And for me, this is interesting, the whole notion of enslavement that keeps cropping up. And again, I'm going from World War II to the contemporary, right? For communists throughout the world, still quoting Mao, the task now is to mobilize the people of all countries and organize an international united front to fight fascism and defend the Soviet Union, defend China, and defend the freedom and independence of all nations. In the present period, every effort must be concentrated on combating fascist enslavement. And the reason I want to start with that is because the language of fascism is now proliferating in the academy. There's Jason Stanley, the philosopher at Yale, right? So after January 6th, he begins writing about, you know, this is what triggers in his mind. I know we had a critique of imagination yesterday as being somewhat infantile, but let's say whether it's the imaginary or the material, January 6th triggered in his mind that the democracy was trending towards proto-fascism. My argument is that anti-Black terror is a unique category within that. And as we talked about at dinner or yesterday, and it's, you know, in our community, it's not a joke, but it's the irony of the satire that if Black people had been the majority, there would have been no hesitancy, right, and lethal force. But what triggers Stanley's mind is to see white nationalists attack white folks, right, who are citizens. And then that becomes like, oh, this is a possibility of proto-fascism. The second academic comes to mind, recently I've been hearing the term about fascism, proto-fascism, would be Robin Kelly, right, on the platform with Kimberly Crenshaw. And this is about really DeSantis and the movement to ban books. And so the historical accuracy or objective history, this is a term that was used yesterday, is to be nullified or voided because what you need is a nationalist narrative in which white supremacy is unapologetic, right? And so what triggers Robin Kelly and Kimberly Crenshaw is that our books are no longer available to be taught. And that's when that triggers the words or the phrase, right, of proto-fascism. The third person who comes to mind in terms of contemporary analyses, and again, I'm going back to Mao once I finish my three people, would be Bernie Sanders when he's doing an interview on CNN. And he says that he's embarrassed to be Jewish, right? Because of Netanyahu was always right-wing, but the way in which now the government is steadfastly, unapologetically, reactionary, right? In terms of the violence against Palestinians, that you can shoot up 100 people, I believe 10 or more have died, right? And he starts talking about the billions of dollars of investment in this regime, and that he's so embarrassed, but the embarrassment is not enough. And so he starts using the word of proto-fascism, right? So I'm thinking, when I'm listening to all this, I wouldn't call it, it is popular media, CNN, right? Kimberly Crenshaw's platform is academic, but it's popular, right? Jason Stanley has the platform of Yale, which is the credibility that comes with the academy. That the register of fear and concern that brings this language from Mao, the United Front against fascism in 1941, into 21st century, is a language still that seems to be separated from the terror against black revolutionary formations. That is not what triggers the language of Stanley. It doesn't trigger the language of Robin Kelly, who is a black historian, and it doesn't trigger the language of Bernie Sanders. And I campaigned for him, so I was like, hoping, I want some more language out here, right? And so what I'm trying to do is to situate the origins with Mao, move it forward to the Panthers in 1969 when they organized the United Front, and then to move to the RNA today. And I guess, I'm probably going to talk more than I'm going to read. My fear is that we don't have the language, or the language we use becomes opportunistic based on the lens within which we view the world. But we don't see the terror on the ground that has been consistently there, right? Since, before 1492, but consistently there as an enslavement mechanism that would move capitalism into imperialism, but would bring with it, I'm looking at Orlando Patterson's Slavery and Social Death, the disposability of certain populations without remorse. And so the violence against them never becomes like a question of what's going on with democracy. It's always like, wow, those were bad cops, or wow, that's poison water in Flint, we can do better. Other than, no, we're under siege, because once you trigger the language of fascism or proto-fascism, that tells you you're at a war. That's what Mao was saying, right? But violence against black people does not register as a war to non-blacks. So somehow the material reality of the terror cannot be translated in language that can be connected to all these three people that I've mentioned, who are very progressive and very dedicated. But again, there's a void in the discourse. And I'm wondering how that would be filled if quantum entanglement is actually a real thing. So Mao goes on to talk about the Chinese Communist Party as having three particular tasks. First, use its National United Front against Japan to aid the Soviets and, quote, drive the Japanese imperialists out of China. Second is battle anti-Soviet and anti-communist activities of the reactionaries among the big bourgeoisie. Third is unite against the common foe with everybody in Britain, the United States, and other countries, that those who are opposed to the fascist rulers of Germany, Italy, and Japan, in order to globally resist the Axis powers. In 1953, after the war, we find Nikita Khrushchev, though, taking a different line, and so there will be a Sino-Soviet split. And by the mid-1950s, Khrushchev will be aligned with the concept of peaceful coexistence. And I don't know if do you know what that is? Like I treat you like my students. Do you know what that is? So peaceful coexistence, for me, it's an insurance policy. Because the only nation at the time that ever dropped atomic bombs on anybody had been the US. And did it twice in Japan, right? And some people argue it was a test drive, because the war eventually was going to end, even though you'd have guerrilla warfare on certain islands. But if it was a show of power, it was a flex. It's like, we've got this, nobody else has got this. And the Soviets like, okay, peaceful coexistence. And for Khrushchev, that meant we don't have a war with the United States, because we will not win a war with the United States. And I believe, based on my research as a political scientist, theorist, whatever. I mean, you get all these titles in academia, they don't mean anything. But anyway, I do what I do. So I believe based on my research, right? This is also a nod to the CIA. You can roam around the world and assassinate people in Africa, in the Caribbean, in Asia. You can, spark a genocide in Vietnam. I believe like 55,000 US soldiers were killed. And my dad was an officer there, right? And I know about fragging, when they pull the pin out of the grenade and throw it back to the officer corps, not towards the Vietnamese. So there was a war within that war. This, again, the internal colony is everywhere. And the rebellion within the internal colony is everywhere. But you cannot do that in Eastern Europe. You can't run assassination rings, you can't threaten them. And so even though the Soviets were backing the so-called third world, so the three worlds, Western European, second world, Soviet, communist, Eastern European, third world, everybody else, which is actually the majority of the population of the world, but you got the third rating, right? So you can murder in the so-called third world, but you can't murder in the second world. You can devastate in the so-called third world. And so for me, the internal colony is like the external colonies. They are fabricated, created, reduced to the zone of disposability. And when Khrushchev agrees to peaceful coexistence, that will tell you that at some point, the communist bloc will not support third world liberation. And the communist bloc will not support CIA-driven assassinations. So I'm going to jump around now because I get tired of reading. So one of the things I'm trying to grapple with, and we were talking about this at dinner last night, what does it mean to have solidarity with disposable people? And I don't think I could convey that from the book talk, and I don't think I conveyed it as dinner either. And yeah, we can say the three worlds don't exist anymore since, the Berlin Wall came down. But there is a polarization around race as a global phenomenon, right? Where extractions happen, where people disappear. If we remember, like last month was the anniversary of Malcolm X's assassination, right? And now his daughters are suing not just the NYPD, and they've hooked up with Ben Crump, who follows or is connected to impacted families as a civil rights attorney. They're suing not just the NYPD, they're suing the FBI and the CIA for $100 million. And they wouldn't go forward unless they had credible data on all three of those agencies or police formations. But this is after the fact in terms of restitution. And it doesn't stop the war. And again, it doesn't have the discourse about the war. So Malcolm is assassinated after he's in Africa, after he's making connections with African liberation units. He's recognized and profiled on the level of the CIA. That is true also of the Black Panthers. What happens with the West Coast Panthers is I believe that they agreed, they called it something different, to peaceful coexistence. And I believe that that's what radical liberals do today. They've agreed to peaceful coexistence. Like, we know you can take us out, you can bury us in prison on terrorist charges because we're trying to protect a forest, you can shoot us in our bed, you can shoot us when we're walking, talking, et cetera, et cetera. And so the fear factor actually shapes our political responses that we tag as revolutionary. And I don't even know how that works. Like, if you're always afraid of the state and its police forces, when would you ever rebel? And I think this is what I found out when I was doing the anthologies with the political prisoners, or when they became friends, or some of them became family. There is an emotional register, a level of emotional intelligence that connects to the politics. That rebellion is just part of devotion. And devotion is linked to death. And the death can be your ability to be free, or the death can be, like literally with Fred Hampton and Mark Clark, pre-dawn raid, December 4th, 1969, when they shoot you up in your own bed, right? And I don't think the academy has trained us to be emotionally intelligent enough to be able to discern the reality of terror. And so in the absence of that, it engineers language that says, well, if we can speak about it, then we comprehend it. And what I'm suggesting is that we don't comprehend it because we don't truly speak about it. We speak around it. We talk at the edges. We codify it like January 6th, oh, now let's talk. Or, oh, book banning, now let's talk. Oh, the Israeli aggression, now let's talk. The first, second, and third worlds, even if they're supposed to no longer exist, the world of disposability of racialized, colonized people has always been a mainstay for over half a millennia. And there's no language that I've found that is competent to address that, other than some aspects, I would say, of Afro-pessimism. And ironically, everybody hates the Afro-pessimists. And I'm like, well, they're the most intelligible. I mean, they say we don't have a project, a political project, because nobody wants to go to war against an empire. And so you can't articulate and keep your job, or keep your money, or host your conferences, or not be shamed, or humiliated, or tracked, or surveilled if you go rogue. That means to go outside the discourse. And so I'm going to move from that to the second and then move to the clip. One of the things that Mao does, and I'm going to stop quoting him, because he go on all day. One of the things Mao does is that he hooks up with black radicals and revolutionaries. But the only way that happens in the 1960s is they have to go to him. And the only way they end up, specifically Robert Williams and his wife Mabel Williams, right, that they end up in China, first they're in Cuba, then they go to China, is because the FBI is hunting black revolutionaries, black rebels in the internal colonies. So Robert Williams is the author of Negroes with Guns. And however you find that interesting or provocative today, it was completely incendiary decades ago during the civil rights movement. But here's the pragmatic moment in which I see the theory. His position is that King lived longer because there were armed brigades of black people who warned the Klan, who were assassins, that we will be watching you while you watch the nonviolent civil disobedience or civil rights activists. And so we credit like restraint on the part of the state or the restraint on the part of terrorists. No, there was actually an armed faction that said, you know, we're not going to be the aggressor, but they're going to like do their peaceful thing and try to vote, and you're not going to shoot them. Because if you shoot at them, we will shoot at you. And somehow that's like just pragmatic politics. And it's not incendiary, but somehow it disappears from civil rights discourse and teaching civil rights studies, right? Inside high school, college, university. So what happens is the FBI comes for him. Also, he's like in leadership in the NAACP in North Carolina, and they kick him out. It's not a good look, right? To verbally state your intent to have self-defense is prohibited if you're black. And so he writes a book titled Negroes with Guns. FBI starts to hunt him and his wife. They flee so they don't go to prison. They end up in Cuba. And then he ends up in China. It is Robert Williams who gets Mao to write a statement on August 8, 1963, that asserts that black people have the right to rebellion as an internal colony. That is a statement you would never hear from the CPUSA or the CPSU, the Communist Party of the Soviet Union, because they're doing peaceful coexistence. I'll fast forward and talk about Che Guevara. It's a time, going to the United Nations, right? And saying to the UN, we would be happy to abide by peaceful coexistence, and he has a sense of humor, if you would stop killing us, right? But by 67, he dies and he's talking because of Patrice Lumumba is assassinated with the, architecture of the CIA in 1961. This is how Malcolm gets kicked out of the Nation of Islam. When Kennedy is assassinated in 63, he says, chickens coming home to roost. Like, what do you think? You murder people around the globe, they're not gonna murder you? And then this becomes the pretext to push him out because he's becoming too politicized, right? So, in August, and I wanted you to think about this, and then I'll say a few more words about the Panthers, and then we'll jump to the clip. There are always the people who have clarity of sight and speech. Like, there are people who have clarity of sight, but they're mute. And so they don't read it the way Robert Williams read it and said it publicly, put it in a book. And so what he says to Mao makes a statement August 8th before the historic March on Washington. And Mao says you have the right to self-protection, you have the right to self-defense, you have the right to rebellion. Because Mao believes at the time you have the right to struggle against imperialists as an internal formation, right? So when King does the I have a dream speech, which is very, as a kid I cried, I teached it. It was just, it's so emotionally intelligent and resonant. But he agreed to sacrificial terms of martyrdom, which I don't think you can impose on a community. If you want to go out based on your understanding of spirituality and devotion, that's a personal choice. You cannot mandate that a whole group of people have to go out the same way, meaning that they shouldn't have resistance. And what he doesn't know is that baked into that anniversary of I Have a Dream speech, which Barack Obama rechannels, he chooses the same date when he announces the Mile House Stadium in Colorado. It's the anniversary of the murder of Emmett Till. So it's muted, but it's present. Like, you have to listen. It's almost like a whisper. We're talking about consistent terror that never ends, the right to self-defense, the right to longevity. But that is not a national project. That is not an academic project. And that is not the project of the black bourgeoisie. So the Panthers are shot up. In '69, they try to do the United Front Against Fascism with SDS. It doesn't work. And it's the West Coast Panthers, so it's not even stable. And once they're decimated, and then they war against each other, West Coast, Huey Newton sends death squads over to the East Coast. East Coast goes underground. It's no longer about self-defense. It's about revolutionary struggle on the East Coast. That's not the same thing as self-defense. And so now you get the formation of the Republic of New Africa. So we'll watch 11 clips of this, and then hear your questions, critiques, and go forward. I just want to give like a background of this. So they're in Jackson, Mississippi, of course, right? And the RNA was formed, and the Republic of New Africa was formed in 1968. Black Panther Party for Self-Defense was formed in 1966. But there were Black Panthers in Alabama. And again, kind of like Robert Williams, Negroes with Guns, they had formed themselves because the students coming from the North, from the Midwest, coming, as pacifists, were being shot up. Goodman, Schwerner, and Chaney, right? So 2 white students, 1 black high school student, they were murdered. Viala Luzo, a white woman, civil rights movement activist from, I want to say Chicago, but somewhere from the Midwest, mother of 5. She's driving black civil rights, activist youth to the Montgomery airport, in Alabama. She's assassinated by the Klan. The deaths were constant. It's the people who were the sharecroppers, the people working on, they understood the pragmatics. And they explained, like, if you're going to do this peaceful stuff, you're going to need an outer ring of protection. It's not going to come from the police. They're the Klan, and it won't come from the FBI. They're going to decimate anything that looks like it's radical or even progressive. So 66, the Panthers form in Oakland. 68, the RNA forms. The BLA is going to form about 1970, 71. So the event they're talking about took place in 1970, and this is the quantum entanglement I'll close with. So you know about Kent State, right? Right. So that hits the papers more because it's 4 white students. In Crosby, Nails, and Stash, 4 dead in Ohio. And then black musicians do their rendition of it. There's a beautiful version where they use Hendrix's guitar, to make it sound like machine guns, whatever. So when the 4 white students are killed by the National Guard, and they're not all activists, some were just walking to the library. But their opposition to the war in Vietnam, right, became a sign, the rare sign of white middle class disposability. But when that happened at Jackson State, which is a HBCU, the black students protested the murder of the white students. And the local police came and shot into every dormitory indiscriminately. And then you have 4 more dead, but they're black students, so nobody knows their names and they don't remember that went down. And they wounded a lot of people and they arrested them. So the House of Republic of New Africa is down the street. And so they're not college students. They don't even probably interact with us. Like, we're militant. She says government a lot, Tamu does, because they're forming an independent nation, right? So when she says government, she's talking about their own, I call it marronage, but no, we have state government, we take care of ourselves, we feed ourselves, we protect ourselves. The students aren't really involved, but it's quantum entanglement. The black students were entangled with the white students in Ohio, even though they're in the Deep South. The RNA is entangled with the black students up the street, even though they don't talk. And it keeps triggering a response. So the Republic of New Africa makes it clear to the police, like, this is not acceptable. So if you just are going to keep doing this, anticipate a response. And that for them became, well, okay, well, then we have the right to shoot you up. Pre-dawn. It was not just the local police, it was the FBI. It was not just the FBI and the local police, they brought a tank. It's like, wait, it's a neighborhood, you need a tank. Yeah, we need a tank. And they shoot up and they shoot people, and then they made the decision to, quote, shoot back. That is prohibited. And so this I borrow from the Afro-pessimists, which I'm not one, and they keep telling me to stop saying I'm not. But anyway, I think there is a possibility of quantum entanglement. I don't have the language for it. So maybe in what's left of our discussion, we could actually see if theory is not just a weapon, but also a gift. And if the material world reflects those theories, or if mostly this is performative fear in terms of what is fascism and who then becomes victim and then who becomes disappeared because they're already rendered as part of what is disposable. Thank you.
Wow, I found that very moving. And I think we have about 15-20 minutes of questions for questions and discussion. So I can sort of kick us off as kind of following directly from that. You know, talking about the fear, talking about the fear factor. You know, some of us, those who are also kind of active in social movements, just recently lost a comrade, right, on January 18th. And Afro-Indigenous environmental activist, Tortuguita in Atlanta, right? And I'm just thinking about some of what you said. Like, last night we talked about science fiction, remember? Like, you mentioned
Octavia Butler.
And you even mentioned Frank Herbert's Dune.
Dune, yeah.
And in one of Tortuguita's last interviews, they quoted from Dune. They were asked if they're afraid of kind of occupying the forest, and they responded by quoting sort of the famous mantra from Dune: "I must not fear. Fear is the mind killer. Fear is the little death that brings total obliteration. I must face my fear. I will permit it to pass through me and past me, and when it has gone, I will look and see its path. Where the fear has gone, only I will remain." Right. And it's sort of like that, quoting from memory, so not precisely right. But it now sort of became a mantra for a courageous movement. And I'm just sort of concerned that a lot of our research as critical scholars highlights kind of the power of the state, like the murderous, the deadly power of the state, and just wondering if you can speak a little bit more about that, and whether we can give people more mantras to inoculate them from fear, and whether we can pivot to focus on the state's limitations
Yeah.
and to allow kind of agency to emerge.
Yeah, I worked for a while with a committee called Love Not Fear, and it's headed by Julia Wright, the daughter of Richard Wright, right? So, I mean, through her father, she has U.S. citizenship. Through her mother, who I believe was from Poland, and I think he ended up in France. She has European citizenship, so she's mostly in Europe. And at first I didn't get it, because I was like, how does that work? But then I started to better understand it, because Mumia is coming up for an evidentiary hearing. I mean, the whole trial was corrupt. But then here's the play. In the past, it would be like these white racist judges. And a friend of mine went to the court, the hearing, and it's like, she had the braids and the nails and stuff. It's a sister, Judge Clemens. And she has this narrative about, like, my great-grandfather was lynched, and we were frightened, and we were impoverished. But now look at, U.S. democracy works, I'm a judge now, right? And then when Mumia comes up, after all the, like, social defendants, I'll call them, and it's that familiar thing, like you call them by the first name. Told you I didn't want to see you here again, but I'll give you 9 months instead of 16, et cetera, et cetera. But the fact is, and like, why would you fear her, right? Because she looks like you, or like community. But the fact is, she doesn't run anything the state does. And the state in Philly, I mean, they're one of the few places that had to be investigated by the FBI. Nobody goes to, but their violence, the Philly cops were like off the hook, and a lot of cops are off the hook, but like Chicago is like, 5 stars for murder, and Philly was like torture and murder kind of thing, right? So when I was grappling with what is my role in this endeavor, and Mumia does the afterword too, In Pursuit of Revolutionary Love, the book that just came out, I was like a pain in the neck. I think they kind of maybe kicked me out of the committee. But it was like, I just kept challenging, what do you mean by not having fear? We have to have fear. And then like months later, I'm like, well, maybe I was wrong. I'm not quite sure. I mean, obviously, I don't have answers. I just raise questions. I understood the intent. I was afraid it was going to shift and become some liberal, like, sentimental maudlin something that I can't stomach anymore, right? And I realized that's not quite what they were doing, or not what Julia Wright was doing. There were liberals in the committee, and it was like, we have to write her how much her story's compelling, and we're sorry that happened to her. And I had to rewrite my public letter to her multiple times. So I didn't just call her out. And I think the fear, at least that I have personally, I can't speak for anybody else. At first I thought it was about being censored and marginalized in the academy. But I'm already censored and marginalized. And people try to kill my career, obviously it didn't work. So it's, what is fidelity? And would I be faithful to Mumia, or to working class people, or the people most likely to be shot up, which is, if black people, it's not the black bourgeoisie. We live around wealthy white people for a reason. They're like an insurance policy. Like, because a stray bullet might go in their house, and then like all hell breaks loose, right? So you embed yourself in elite institutions because it's just a firewall, or the kind of violence people would like to dump on you, they can't quite make the reach. Not because of your personal capacity, it's the corporation, right? And so I was realizing finally that if I'm not afraid of isolation, if I'm not afraid of disavowal, if I'm not afraid of being slandered, if I'm not afraid of being attacked, then the only fear that's left is around mortality, and also what I owe my kids. But I kept meeting Panthers, and they were like conflicted, like, because maybe their kids hate them. Because like, oh, you went to war to free the other people, what about me? I needed a parent. You could have been more conservative. Like, there's all these contradictions. But that is a personal fear. And I think that we can manage our personal fears, but it's when it becomes a collective phenomenon shaped by the state and shaped by leadership that tells you to constantly obey, and that a liberal is really a revolutionary, so there's nothing to fear. You can be a movement millionaire, right, and still be a revolutionary. You can be an academic with all these honors and titles, and still, I'm not a revolutionary. Like hello. It's like, you didn't figure that one out, right? But we're constantly told, don't be afraid because we've got this. And we know the way out of hell. And what I'm saying is like, whatever my personal self-preservation instinct is, as I get older, it's wearing down. The kids are older, they're gonna survive, they're gonna be left with resources. So there's nothing to fear except for what's in my mind. And then it's just a chess game with the state. Like, you know, Tortuguita, right?
Yeah.
Didn't have bourgeois accessories or networks. And so when I constantly have to register those kinds of deaths, I become less afraid. But that doesn't make me sloppy in terms of how I'm going to make a move. Yeah, I adore Ida B. Wells. I abide by ancestors. And I was saying this last night, because like part of the narrative of politics today is that we have to be pragmatic, which means then you should be afraid and you obey the state, which means you never can change the state because you're obeying the state, right? And so I think of her as an ancestor, and like there's a podcast we were doing that's in the book when people are like, what about pragmatic politics? And I was like, we would never have ancestors if we were all pragmatic. Malcolm wasn't, Martin wasn't, Medgar Evers wasn't. I mean, they risked their lives because they were devoted and they loved people, or they love the concept of freedom, or all of the above. If they're pragmatic, as I said before, Martin Luther King would have had like a mega or a small church somewhere. Malcolm would have taken the money. A lot of people tried to buy him out. And Ida B. Wells would have been like, oh, you murdered the father of my 2-year-old goddaughter, Maureen, and I'm gonna cry this one out and do therapy and like move north. And I'm not opposed to therapy, and I probably need more. But the fact is that an ancestor like Ida B. Wells tells me that I exist. And it's not imaginary. It is culture. And this is what I think people don't get. This is maybe where AP might be right. And we disagree, but we agree on some things. I don't think the general society understands what it means to mutate over 4 centuries of terror and mass rape and loss. You would have to mutate, you know, just to not do a mass die out, right? And so Ida B. Wells registers to me as a form of longevity. Now that she gets the Pulitzer a couple of years ago, I think then like they're refashioning, and nobody talks about the weaponry. I do it, I've only been doing it in the last couple of years, I do it from the right wing, right? Because I rolled with the communists and I knew Davis, like during the Cold War, and I'm in Africa or Moscow or doing whatever I'm doing, it became, oh, like you went too far left, the infantile left. It's like, no, I can talk about technology because I grew up with a military officer and I was in ROTC. And so my understanding of what the state does and how they do it is based on like, you know, as I said, my best years were Fort Benning, which is where it's in Atlanta, right, in Georgia. It's where the School of the Americas, SOA, is, which is called the School of Assassins, because they literally train death squads, mostly for Latin America, but they also put them out in Africa, right? So your proximity to violence, it could be like you grew up on the, you know, in a certain kind of under-resourced neighborhood, and you grew up, I know some grad students, like their parents are in the underground economies. My parents, because my mother was a co-partner, like by throwing parties for officers and bullshit. My parents rolled with Empire, and Empire was doing genocide. And so you get taught different things at home. And then your capacity is like, well, that's the real world. This other one that you're performing that's safe and stable. And fortunately, mine came back from war. But then like they did the slow suicide in their 50s. Some people went fast because they couldn't grapple with the contradictions, right? But you grow up with the contradictions and then you're like, Ida B. Wells makes sense to me. But then other people are like, oh no, you can't talk about technology. And then even when we use it, I think of this sister, was it Tatiana Jefferson? Like she has the 8-year-old in the room and like she's standing at the door and the cops shoot through the window. Like, I think he got some prison time or something like that. But I'm just doing to her and to Wells that the technology is insufficient. You would have to have theory and strategy. Wells had theory and strategy. In the 21st century, I think our theory is really muddled because our revolutionary struggles have been sold back to us as some kind of simulacra. And everybody's got like a Panther hoodie or something. But it's like, wait, do you know the contradictions? What's the context? And do you understand devotion? That's the only, like, I was at a philosophy conference in Chicago years ago, and it was the black women were in the room and a lot of white students, but they wanted to hear about the captive maternal, so as soon as I finished my talk, they left. But they were like, we're going back and forth, and I was like, the black women, you're captive maternal, you are, and they were like, oh, shut up already. And I was like, no, it's real. Like, you were captive by love, but we're on different levels of political struggle. But then an African sister said, this doesn't make sense. What about the Panthers? Didn't they want to, like, somewhere you're missing their politics because they wanted longevity? And I was like, oh, that's it. That's the fear factor. It's like, no, the ones I knew, the East Coast, they thought they'd be dead by 1920, 21. And they agreed to the terms. Like Holder will say, you know, he had a black father, white mother. It was his white Jewish mother, like, you know, University of Chicago, got a degree when she was 20. She introduced him to Martin Luther King at a march. By the time he was 11, King had been assassinated. And he's like, oh, it's a war. And then he talked to his older brother, and then when he's 12, it's like, we're going across the street and we're going to join the Panthers. I was like, wait, weren't you supposed to run away from the war? Because war is where death is. And they're like, no, I mean, I'm glad the state made it clear. We're going into the war. So longevity, I mean, King said that, longevity has its place. He did it from another, you know, spiritual, mystical place. But I know revolutionaries who said the same thing King did, but it wasn't as a pacifist. It's just, again, I don't think we have a shared language. But going to somebody like Ida B. Wells, Fannie Lou Hamer, right? Those people will register to me. I don't find anybody contemporary who's in the academy that faithfully abides by who they were, meaning those historic ancestral folks. I feel that they've done a makeover. And so now they're commodities, just like Panthers are becoming commodities. Just so, in terms of quantum, I hear what you say and I agree. I don't disagree. I just want to add to it about quantum entanglement. If, you know, based on the professor I met at Bucknell, if we actually are just an extension of nature, and that's where we return to, right? I'm still curious if the individual is more of an abstract. I mean, the capacity to have speech is all about interacting with others, right? The empathy, et cetera, all these aspects to ourselves that become damaged or severed because of trauma and violence. I wonder then if the way to restore ourselves is the individual's, you know, therapeutic or self-therapy, but the collective therapeutic is absolutely the ground. Like, I mean, that's the return to the earth, the return to the water, and the return to the community. And I think because of the capitalism, we're better at least, you know, yoga, your therapist, your massage therapist, like how many therapists do you have? Like a lot. But it seems to me the collective one is that's where we're not trained. We're trained to seek, like, do your spa thing or go to, you know, Omega, do the meditation, like go to like the sanctuary for a couple of weeks as individuals to purchase that time and space and care, or deliver it at home if you don't have that kind of disposable income. But then what would that look like in terms of a collective communal that has to happen in a war zone? I mean, this is the part about the war zone, and again, I'm not using it as a metaphor. PTSD doesn't end until the war ends. You can like, oh, I got patched up. And then it's like, well, we're going to send you back out on the front lines. And then I'm going to get shot up again. Well, that's just the nature of war. And it's like, you don't even have to be on the front lines. You know, Tyree Nichols, you're like, I'm going to go skateboard or something, right? It's just like the contradicting commands of police forces that are predatory. So in the absence of changing the environment, meaning to shift it away from its predatory impulses as well as its predatory strategies, you're doing triage. And some people you can save, other people bleed out. Like, you know, it doesn't have to be the blood per se of the body, but just their energy, their psyche, their intellectualism, their willingness to stand up for themselves, to claim honor in a state that's based on dishonor. That is what I would find to be really fascinating and worth devotion. What would collective therapy be? Not that you bought everybody like a spa ticket to something, but if, you know, this is back to the Panthers. And again, I think they've been worn down, they're shot up, they have mental issues too, right? Emotional issues. But what would it be like? What is a rebellion that is shaped by quantum entanglement? And then following that, what is a revolutionary struggle against not just the counter-revolutionaries that are officially employed by the state, who like capture what I was saying about the Ida B. Wells moment, right? So we were talking about this last night. The CIA has a statue in their quad, and it's Harriet Tubman. And I just feel like it's really a bad joke, or you're just spitting on us, right? But, you know, when I don't even know the name of the guy who runs the CIA right now, and the CIA reports directly to the president, so the presidents can't keep pretending like they don't know about, you know, kill us. But he's standing there with the black Harriet Tubman and her rifle and her pistols, and he's like, she was the first spy, so now she's us. And I was like, no, you would... That's not how it worked. Like, she was fighting a revolutionary struggle that the North won because Lincoln finally allowed 200,000 blacks to fight in the Civil War. Because we first like, I don't know black people with guns, not sure. But okay, well, the North is losing. Do you have a plan? Okay, black people with guns, right? And then there'll be the betrayal, you know, with the Hayes-Rutherford Act. And then other stuff, convict prison lease system, where we're killed because they work us to death because we belong to the state. So we died faster when we were free than we have when we were enslaved. All these contradictions. But I can't say colonies. But anyway, just the like, and what is it? A certain kind of body parts to just stand there and claim Harriet Tubman, who was a black liberator, as belonging to the CIA, which historically assassinated black liberators. And then be able to, like, in the commercial, and like, black people join the CIA, which they are doing. They did an ad for black lesbians too, right? And I'm like, okay, something needs to disrupt this. Because this is an extension of war. I don't know if you got it or not, but believe me, it's an extension of war. That all your liberators really worked for the state, or they could be claimed by the state and be their mascots, like, you know, a century or so later. So how would you, like, how would you have a confrontation with that? Like, you can't roll up to and, like, you know, topple the statue. Like, you're definitely going to get probably, you know, terrorist charges or something, right? You can't even get into the quad. But this is what I mean, like, what we know to be true of struggle has turned into a commodities market that is run by the state and nonprofits. And then what would it mean to heal yourself or to have a therapeutic intervention to resist that? And understand, like, if this is not going to be like Catch-22 or some Kafka thing going on, you would have to rebel. And again, you could be a pacifist while you're doing it. And they will still imprison you and shoot you up, possibly. So it doesn't matter if you're a pacifist or a militarist. What matters is that you're a rebel. And what is a rebel? Thinker who is a rebel lover? What is a rebel strategist? And how do rebels survive in the academy, which is anti-revolutionary? The FBI and the CIA are counter-revolutionary. Academics are anti-revolutionary. This is like, who's paying for this building? I mean, come on. Right? And so those are the questions I have. Obviously no answers. But I would say, I guess we're out of time, like, if you believe in devotion, and if there is a possibility of quantum entanglement, then perhaps we have capacities that we've never explored. And then we would just go on a path of pursuit, and I'm not trying to push the book right here, revolutionary love, or whatever you want to call it. Whoever your ancestors are, whoever your kin, because the death will continue. And black people will remain the canaries in the coal mine. And I don't believe in like endless suffering just because you're comfortable with it. So thank you.
Oh,